All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and welcome to the Cooperating Raleigh College's Staff Professional Development Mini-Series event. The Disability Services Directors Panel discussion is what you are attending right now. We're thrilled to have you. And we're thrilled that you've chosen to join us in an effort to learn more about disability services and how to be a more inclusive community for those who may have disabilities on our campuses. Just a few housekeeping notes as we are all getting into the Zoom meeting. You will have the opportunity to engage with each other and with our panelists using some of the Zoom features. So feel free to use the chat feature. You may be prompted to use it as we go along, so make sure that you have that open. Also, at the end of the session, we will open it up for live questions. So feel free to use the Q&A feature to send questions to be asked by our moderator directly to her. Our moderator today is Ms. Consuela Jones. Consuela serves as the Administrative Support Specialist for the Disability Services Office at NC State University. She's also a member of the Cooperating Raleigh College's Staff Professional Development Committee. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Consuela.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this event today with us. At this time, I would like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. And in introducing yourselves, please include your title, your institution, and a brief background of your experience in the Disability Services Office. And I would like to start with Carolyn, if you would start us, Carolyn.
Thank you, Consuela. I'm Carolyn Koning. I am the Assistant Director for Disability Services at Meredith College. At Meredith, Disability Services is housed under the Counseling Center. So that's sort of a different way of doing things. I have worked in disability services in one way or another for over 20 years. I started off in Wake County Public School System, worked in overseas at an international school, came back and worked at a community college, and have been at Meredith since 2017.
Thank you, Carolyn. Mark Newmiller, would you like to go next?
Good afternoon. I'm Mark Newmiller. I'm the Director of the Disability Resource Office at NC State. I have been in this office since 2003, and before that, I was a special education teacher in Wake County Public Schools and up in Virginia.
Thank you, Mark. And Tiffany Tuma?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Tiffany Tuma. I currently serve as the Assistant Dean for the Center for Academic Success and Accessible Education, a very long title. I wear many hats here at St. Augustine's University. I've been in this role for about 2.5 years. This is my first role in higher ed working with disability or accessibility services. And as I serve our traditional SAU students, I also work with the Wake County early college students who may have accommodations. And my background is in counseling and in higher ed. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists, for introducing yourselves today. And we will go ahead and get started with our first question. What are some common misconceptions about students requiring accommodations from disability services? And Mark, if you would respond to that question for us.
Sure. So I think the best way to answer that is to sort of flip it and ask the attendees what they think are some misconceptions for students who require accommodations, people with disabilities. So I'm going to ask you to put some of those thoughts in the chat. It is a safe space, so please let us know what are some misconceptions, and then I can add some if we don't see the ones that I have in my mind. Don't everyone type at once. So let's. Okay. So physical disability to qualify for services. Yeah, sure. A visible disability. That's right. There's still that misconception. It's not about physical disability. There's also invisible disabilities, although I like to say hidden disabilities rather than invisible. Mental health, learning disabilities, cognitive, all that is part of disability. So that's right. It's not just physical disabilities, visible disabilities. All animals can be service animals. That is a misconception. I think we'll probably talk about that in a little bit. Students are not as capable of others. That's definitely one, that they're not capable. Most universities don't have a special admissions process for students with disabilities. They have to meet the entrance requirements based on their merits. So they are just as capable. However, they're because of their limitations and the environment that the academic setting is in, it causes barriers for them to be able to participate. Needs are not relevant or helpful to disabled students. Yeah, there's a lot of things. Universal design, has created a lot of opportunities for everybody. You think about going into a grocery store and going out of a grocery store with bags and the automatic doors. Most of the things that are offered to students with disabilities could be very helpful for everybody. You have to have an IEP to receive services. That's correct. An IEP is an individualized education plan used in the K-12 environment. And right, that you don't have to have had an IEP to use accommodations in college. There's a lot of students, a lot of people who are diagnosed with a disability or acquire a disability later in life. So at any point in time that someone has a disability, they can disclose that they have a disability and request accommodations. You can always see or understand all disabilities, right? A lot of them are hidden. Accommodations are implemented without follow-up letters to faculty. At NC State, and I think at pretty much almost every university, there is an accommodation letter. How that process gets the letter to the instructor might be different, but every instructor should be receiving an accommodation letter of what those accommodations the student is approved for. And a lot of times students will not necessarily follow that process and will talk to instructors about accommodations, but there is a process, and the Disability Resource Office or Services Office is is responsible for determining what approved accommodations and then notifying the instructors. Accommodations will be the same in college as they were in high school. Yeah, right. That's a misconception. That's a myth. That doesn't happen. High school, it's two different laws. High school is governed under IDEA, which is basically student success based, and higher education's Title II of the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So it is equal opportunity to participate. So those accommodations could look and usually do very different from what a student may have received in high school to what they're using in college. Disclosure to professors and classmates is still up to parents. Correct. A lot of parents seem to think that they still have a role in this process. And so I know at NC State, I'll speak about NC State, but we're very friendly the first few times that we interact, and then we sort of wean the parents away from the students. It is the student's responsibility to be an advocate for themselves and to disclose they have a disability and to follow the process to get accommodations if they qualify. Some don't think that they qualify. Services for TBI. Didn't want to be labeled. Yeah, so again, a lot of people don't know if they get services. There's that misconception that it's just physical access, and that's not the case. And I will say, again, this is NC State, and I'm thinking this is probably most universities, and the other panelists can correct me if I'm wrong about their university, but there is no, the students don't have anything on their transcript that would notify anybody that they used accommodations or that they have a disability. And faculty, instructor notifications, other campus partners, if there's an accommodation that a student needs to participate, such as housing, the Disability Resource Office or Services Office does not share the diagnosis. That's not something that anybody needs to know. It's just the functional limitations of that student and what accommodations they might need. That's great. You guys know all the misconceptions. I think some of the pushback that we get at NC State a lot of times are, well, that's going to be extra work, or they need special help. And we don't see it that way. We sort of view it as the environment itself that's been created has not included people with disabilities. So of course there is some back end work that must be done, but the accommodations do not lower standards or change or alter fundamental alteration to the essential coursework. It is a conversation between the Disability Resource Office and faculties, instructors, departments. Also, I'd like to say that no one has said it, but they're not an inspiration. They are people just like everybody else. They have thoughts and feelings. They want to get a college education. They're just on a personal note, I see that a lot of, oh, this person, she's worked so hard. She's worked just as hard as everybody else. She just lives with a disability. So I don't know if Carolyn or Tiffany, you want to add?
Thank you so much, Mark, for that response. Our next question, what is the most common ADA compliance violation and how do colleges and universities avoid making it? And I would like to ask Carolyn and Tiffany to respond to that.
I don't know if this is like actually the most common, but I do think one that is easy to do by accident is electronic access and having inaccessible websites. And I think something that faculty do unintentionally sometimes is adopt inaccessible publisher materials. And so for example, Pearson My Math Lab is notorious for being difficult for students who use screen readers to access. And just because the sales rep says, oh, it's completely accessible, that is not necessarily the case. Sometimes like the first few chapters of a PowerPoint for each chapter will be accessible, and then the rest isn't. So, it might be a good idea to have a colleague look at it or even a student. So I think that one of the best ways to avoid it is to have procurement protocols and to get your instructional design department involved, and just so that people who know and can identify what's accessible and what's not. During the pandemic, the Meredith Science Department used Labster for online labs. I mean, we had to do something, and it was interesting because there were parts of that program that were not accessible, and they knew it. And we had a blind student in a bio lab, but what they did was they hired an extra, the science department, not disability services, the science department took responsibility for that because that was going to be the best resource for their department. I'm pointing over to the science department. And they had someone that worked one-on-one with our blind student to make sure that she had equal access. So it was not ideal, but it was our responsibility to make that material accessible. And if you want to see an interesting case that's happening right now nationally, the Los Angeles Community College District has been sued by blind students because like 31 students, Mark or Tiffany, y'all can correct me, I'm not sure, but and they won for textbooks, handouts, websites. Well, the tragic thing is that LACCD has appealed it twice, and so it's kind of a hot mess. But the moral of the story is if they win, it could do irreparable damage to the way that ADA is interpreted. And I just bring that up because if you want to sign a petition, you can sign a petition. But electronic access. Tiffany, what were you going to add?
Yeah. So again, I don't know if it's based on data or research, but I know specifically on our campus, parking, ramps, and restrooms. And I think sometimes as institutions, when we renovate various facilities, buildings, we don't necessarily have our ADA compliance hats on. So for us, a challenge in recent years, did we have enough parking spaces? Were those parking spaces car and van accessible? Were they in the appropriate places and adjacent to the buildings? A specific example, and this predated my time here, My building is now an administrative building, but it was once a residential hall. So we needed to update the automatic door buttons. We needed to add wheelchair ramps. We needed to make sure that the restroom stalls were large enough. And I think all those things can be fixed if the appropriate people are at the table. So, and not necessarily, this is not specific to my institution, this is just in general. Upper leadership, we just need to ensure that they understand that this is serious, that this is a big deal, and that we rather have the services in place and not need them than to need them and not have them. So if we, have these various conversations with upper leadership that we need the ramps and the buttons and the stalls and the parking and the assistive technology, then we can go ahead and earmark those funds in the budget for the next year and start, slowly adding those resources and services in place.
And I'll just add real quick, Carolyn touched on, the most common that, there's people all over the country that are suing all the universities because of their public facing websites, things like that. And it is really important in choosing accessible materials, whether it be textbooks or even just learning management software and creating accessible documents that are sharing with classrooms. And also, Carolyn mentioned the difficulty she had at Meredith, that they knew it wasn't accessible. Sometimes you're going to have things that aren't accessible, but you don't have a problem yet. And so the important piece is to know that and identify a solution so that when you have someone who shows up and can't access it, you have that alternative for that person. And as Tiffany said, with the ADA, just accessibility issues, just one thing to add on to that, and NC State has been really fantastic about this, is just because something meets ADA standards, whether it be a restroom or a private or a bedroom, a building, there's also Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and it's programmatic access, not just meeting the ADA standards. So, we've had to adjust some bathrooms that met all ADA requirements because that student actually couldn't use the bathroom. So that is a responsibility, and it is the university's responsibility, not necessarily the Disability Services Office responsibility.
I would like to thank each of the panelists for responding to that question, and we'll move right along to our next question. I would like to know some options and alternatives regarding transportation to events for students with disabilities. And Mark, if you could respond to that question.
Sure. So, I think I'm not sure what the context of this question is. So, what the requirements are for transportation. If your event or your classroom is providing transportation for all students, then you are responsible for providing transportation for somebody who needs accessible transportation if they travel by wheelchair. And so there are a lot of options available. Depending upon your university, Fleet Services may have an accessible vehicle. If so, that's what you want to get. Although ideally, if you are providing it for everybody and they're taking a bus, renting a bus that is an accessible bus so that everyone can travel together, that is the solution. If that isn't possible, again, going through Fleet Services or there's a lot of private companies that are in the Raleigh area that will, that have accessible vehicles that you can rent, or that they will come and pick up the student or faculty, staff, whoever's participating in that event. If you are not responsible for transportation, but they have to go on a field trip and all students are responsible for themselves, just some best practices would be, depending upon the size of your classes and things, but if you are encouraging students to carpool together, you're isolating that student who travels by wheelchair or needs that accessible vehicle because they're not going to be able to ride with other people unless that person can transfer from a wheelchair into the car seat, which many can. But there is public accessible transportation through Go Triangle Access. They provide, it's not door to door, but it's just like the bus system. So if there's a bus that is inaccessible, they can use that and they can get around town. So there's a lot of options available. If you just Google accessible transportation in Raleigh, you'll be able to find that. But I think it's the key piece is if you are providing transportation, you have to find transportation. And if you're not, I encourage you to offer, options for students because they might live on campus and just not know what those options are available.
Tiffany and Carolyn, would you all like to add anything to that? Okay, thank you, Mark. Our next question, what are some recommendations to assist students who have not disclosed a disability but may need disability services? And Carolyn and Tiffany, if you all would like to speak on that.
Yes, so I would say to assist students who have not disclosed a disability, I would just encourage our faculty members to continue to include a blurb in their syllabus every semester about ADA and about how to acquire accommodations if needed, and of course include the name and pertinent information of that contact person. Something recently that, because I'm also over advising here at St. Aug, something recently that the advisors we started doing last semester was sending out weekly announcements, and those included important dates in academic affairs, some things, activities for student affairs, but recently I suggested that we should include how to acquire accommodations, how to renew, and the contact person, which would be me. Another idea is to have marketing and communication send out emails at the beginning of the semester to all the students and include name, contact information, and pertinent dates as far as it relates to the disability and accessibility offices. And of course, if you have an app, we have an app, we post everything there. And also on social media, because I actually have more students who respond to me on Instagram than they do via email. So we just need to meet the students where they are, but send out the communication in as many ways as possible so that the students, they won't necessarily say they didn't receive an email, they saw it on social media, they saw it on the app, but just as many ways as possible that we can communicate to our students about who we are and the services that we provide. So again, it's going to be in the syllabus every semester, but again, emails, social media, if you have an app, and definitely connect with the academic advisor or the advising office on campus, since they have high contact with the students so that they can send out the information. Even if the students may need it and they choose not to use it until maybe finals or midterms, which is a lot of times what we see our students do. But those are just some of the recommendations that I had.
I would like to add something that Mark shared at the beginning. Don't accommodate just because the student says, if they tell you, I think I need accommodations, they need to be referred to the disability support office, and they have to have an official letter of accommodation. So I think sometimes faculty are so kind and so generous, and they really do need to have official documentation from the disability support office that confirms the student qualifies. And again, I want to reiterate something Tiffany said. In addition to your syllabus statement, create just a really safe environment. Think about your language. Think about, how are you reducing stigma? Are you making it a safe place for a student to come and confide in you? And don't ever talk to a student in front of other people. Always talk to students privately so that they do feel safe. And it's just really important to create that environment where they don't feel judged or less than. And if you see a student struggling and you sort of think there's something going on here, do not say, you might have a learning disability, don't say that. You know, maybe just develop that relationship with them, offer some strategies, you know, maybe ask them to come to office hours. And then maybe eventually they'll say, you know, I have a hard time paying attention. And, you know, if they sort of start sharing, then it would be appropriate to say, you might want to consult with the folks in disability services and just see what they recommend. But you need to wait until a student self-identifies or asks that question before you make the recommendation to consult with the disability support department.
Thank you, panelists, for that response. Our next question: how are students who must quarantine mid-semester being served in terms of classes and accommodations? And Tiffany, if you would like to reply to that.
Yes, thank you. So just for a little bit of context, our students that are quarantined, they are in a residential hall that is currently not being used by other students. Their meals are being sent over to them. Someone from the Student Health Center tests them regularly, and they're giving cleaning and bathroom supplies. It's not going to necessarily mimic what their personal residential hall room is going to look like, but we just try to make sure they have the basic needs. In terms of accommodations, as soon as they go into quarantine or they are notified that they have to quarantine, we ask them if they have a personal laptop, and if they don't, we make sure they are given a temporary laptop. And then majority of our students, the accommodations that they need are extended time on tests and quizzes, distraction-free or quiet environment, and they're already isolated, so we don't necessarily have to do that. But the instructors either set up a separate virtual link for that student so they can log in, or they are just instructed to complete their coursework asynchronous via Blackboard. So for our students in quarantine, their accommodations are still being met. And that's because the students that we serve, we don't have any students who have any physical challenges or have any assistive technology needs. So they're still able to use, you know, the extra time on writing assignments, testing quizzes, and have that distraction-free environment. But that's, again, that there are no barriers there, again, because we don't have any students who require special technology or have any physical challenges that require other accommodations.
Carolyn or Mark, would you all like to add anything to that question?
Not really, but I mean, it's similar. NC State, all instructors were asked to have a COVID protocol in place for students who were tested positive, so they can access the Zoom meetings or the recordings. They are isolated, you know, when they have COVID. They're given meals. One of the things I think, just to reinforce though, is that there's a difference between a short term where they're accessing the lectures that are not attending the course versus the whole semester. So students tend to get very comfortable sometimes with not attending class. So they'll come to our office and request accommodations to not attend classes anymore because whatever reason. And so that generally that's not something that we would do is to say, yeah, you don't have to go to class. It's really meant to be just a short week or two period where they're able to still somewhat participate in the class while they're in their isolation.
Thank you, Tiffany and Mark. Our next question: what are 3 to 4 questions people should ask themselves when attempting to create an inclusive space for students? And Carolyn, if you would like to address that question, and any other panelists that would like to speak on that question.
I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I think that the first question you should ask yourself is, have I created a safe environment for students to approach me? Have I created am I a safe person? Am I an ally for students to feel comfortable. I'm having trouble with my mouse. There we go. And I think that Tiffany was talking about something that I think we really experience at Meredith as well, because many of us are on these historic campuses that are 100 years old, and we have a hodgepodge of furniture in our classrooms, and so sometimes they're not conducive for someone with a wheelchair. So is there a way I can make this space more inclusive for someone who uses a wheelchair or has a service animal? Can I rearrange this physical space to create a more inclusive environment? And then there's finally something, is there any flexibility for how students can demonstrate the student learning outcomes, the essential learning outcomes? And flexibility is complicated for faculty. I mean, you don't want to just willy-nilly. So if you want to write a paper, you can't do, I know you can't do that. But in some cases, if you know a student is struggling to demonstrate what they're learning in a traditional way, is there a way that they can demonstrate it a different way and still achieve the learning outcomes and not overburden the faculty? So just, am I creating a safe space? How can I make this environment, this physical environment, more inclusive? And then is there any room for any flexibility in achieving student outcomes? For the 3 questions I would suggest.
Tiffany and/or Mark, would you all like to add anything to that question?
I just like to hear myself talk, so of course I would like to. Not that Carolyn didn't say everything. What I would just add on is that, it's not really difficult if you just stop and be intentional about what you're trying to do. But I also think it's extremely important to show the public that you have intentionally thought about it. That creates that much more welcoming environment so that they are open to, as Carolyn said, you're supporting them in their ability to ask, having an accommodation statement, but also saying, this event will be held here, the accessible entrance is here, the parking is here. That's letting people know that you have thought about some issues that they might have. And then again, that accommodation statement, if you have, if you have accommodations you need to participate, please, please let us know. We've tried to create an inclusive environment. I think letting people know that you are trying to, you're going to learn more and more as they come up with those requests.
Thank you. Our next question I'm going to pose to the panelists, so anyone is open to answer for me. And the next question reads as follows: what is the best way for prospective students to find out about what services and support they might qualify for?
I think Dr. Tuma was going to answer this one, and I don't know where she went. But this one's a hard one, because until we engage in the interactive process, until we see the documentation and then talk to a student about it, I mean, we can't guarantee anything. And, many students will say, well, in high school, I got blah, blah, blah. And then sometimes you look at the documentation, you're like, I don't know why you got that. So it's very individualized. It's on a case-by-case basis, and so I don't, Mark, I hope you have a better answer, and I hope Dr. Tuma shows back up. But that, I just think it's a hard thing to promise. Yay, she came back. I just think it's really hard to make any guarantees.
Yeah, I think, the best way is for them to ask questions, to make an appointment, to call the disability resource office for whatever campus they're on or enrolled in, and talk about their situation. There is no promises until they've followed that whole process, but not asking the question is the problem, more than than not getting it. So I think it's having that conversation. We have a lot of students who will contact and say, I don't know if I qualify for, or we also have a lot of staff that will refer students or contact us and say, hey, I've been talking to this student. Should we refer him or her to your office? And we're always happy to have a conversation with a student to find out what's going on. And even if they don't have a disability, we might just have some, a couple probing questions, some screening questions to say, yeah, this is something you might want to talk to the counseling center about, see about getting, further evaluated, things like that. So I think it's just being open to asking that question, having that conversation.
Tiffany, did you want to address that question? All right, we're going to move along. Our next question, if a student or employee mentions they have a disability, how do you know when to initiate the reasonable accommodation option? And Mark, if you would like to take the lead for me.
Sure. My answer, it depends. And that's going to be my answer 99% of the time when someone asks me something. I think it really depends upon the situation and what's going on. Are they mentioning they have a disability just in a, hey, this is, I have a disability. That doesn't necessarily mean, as I said at the beginning, not every person with a disability needs accommodations. But if they are disclosing they have a disability and they need accommodations, again, Carolyn mentioned it before, but, they should be referred to the appropriate office that determines eligibility, for accommodations, whether that be at NC State. The Disability Resource Office handles all student accommodation requests. OIED, Office of Institutional Equity and Diversity, they handle all the employee accommodation requests. So I think it's very important that you refer that person to that process. If it's something they're asking for that isn't necessarily an accommodation, it's just something that you would consider anybody that asks for that, whatever that accommodation might be, you don't have to send a person with a disability through that process. Again, if you would have considered it for anybody who asked for it just because they said they have a disability. But if you are determining whether or not they get that because they've told you they have a disability, I would always encourage people to make sure that they are referring that student or the employee back to that office to have that discussion. Employee accommodations are a lot different than student accommodations. It's a different title of the ADA. And so it's a lot different process. And so generally what will happen is they will have an interview with the employee, talk to the employee, then they'll contact the supervisor and talk about the essential requirements of the job. And then based on those conversations, determine what may or may not be reasonable accommodations for the workplace. Versus the student side, which is we have conversations with the students at NC State anyway. We approve a general list of accommodations based on the functional limitations of the disability. And then we work with faculty, instructors on this backside of when they receive the letter, if they have questions about how to implement those accommodations, or if an accommodation changes or lowers the essential requirements of the course. So we'll have that conversation with them to determine whether or not that accommodation actually is a fundamental alteration or not, and then talk to the student about what alternatives might be available.
Thank you, Mark. Tiffany, you had your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yes, and this was, so I apologize, I was experiencing some technical difficulties, but if I may, I did want to add something to the previous question, and I saw someone in the chat who mentioned something that I was going to say. So in reference to prospective students, to find out what services that we offer and what support, and I'm not sure if this was said because I was off for a minute or so, but we need to ensure that our institutional and departmental web pages are up to date with current information, who works there, the services and support that we offer. Also at new student orientation, this was a practice that I instituted last summer, and I was informed by parents and staff that no one had ever spoken at our store prior to last summer about disability and accessibility services. So it could be a short presentation to the parents and the students, who we are, what we offer, and the difference between, and someone mentioned this earlier, actually it was Mark, the difference between high school accommodations and reasonable accommodations we offer in college, and what documentation may be needed. In addition, when we're going out to recruit at these various college fairs and high school visits, to bring brochures and contact information on disability and accessibility services so that the student and the parent can follow up. And that's all that I wanted to add. And I'm not sure if that was stated by Mark or Carolyn when I was off. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. We appreciate you addressing that question. Our next question is for Carolyn. I will be interested in hearing about common barriers that students with disabilities face in the virtual environment. And Carolyn, if you could speak on that for us.
Okay, I'm just going to speak briefly about students with hidden disabilities, and then I think I'm going to pass it off to Mark to talk about students with visual impairments and students who use screen readers. But students with hidden disabilities actually frequently use screen readers, and so it's important to make sure that the documents and the materials on the learning management system are accessible. And the thing that I would really like to stress, as far as like students with learning disabilities, ADD, anxiety, their tolerance for, they have a low frustration tolerance. And so if they have to click through like 17 levels to get to whatever the assignment is, or whatever the content is, or how the modules are organized, it's just key that it is simple and easy to navigate as far as the way you design your course. And again, I would refer you to your instructional design team for some guidance there. But I find that students with hidden disabilities are like, I can't find the assignment, I can't, when is this due? So it's just crucial to reevaluate, I think, your course design for virtual and the online component to make sure that it is logical and to make sure that it's easily accessible by everyone. And that includes the accessible PDFs. So Mark, if you'll talk about screen readers a little bit.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to realize that students with disabilities face all the barriers that everyone faces with virtual environment. I think we found that there's a lot of people who have a very difficult time in the virtual environment, but also a lot of people who have thrived in the virtual environment. But as Carolyn said, I think attention, learning disabilities, things like that. There's the environment at which they're taking the test is difficult. There could be a lot of distractions within their house. There could be distractions if they're trying to get internet access. So those are all issues, and they're magnified because of their disabilities. As far as blind, low vision, hard of hearing, deaf students, obviously when you go into a virtual environment and students are in the class, and if they lip read, if they're hard of hearing and they lip read, or if they're deaf and lip read, it might be a little bit more difficult to see the lip reading. There could be difficulty with the recordings. If it's recording, we had a lot of instructors who would record the lectures and then post them online. And so there was not the opportunity for students to ask questions or to reconsider what that instructor just said. So I think those are the the barriers that they were encountering, obviously with screen readers or students who use assistive technology to read the information in documents. If they weren't created accessibly, if they were just put out onto the learning management system, not accessible, they couldn't access it. So I think it's the thoughtfulness of making sure that that content is accessible, that if you are hosting a online class and you're recording it, having the captions on helps. Also offering opportunities for students to ask questions, continuing to have those office hours available for students.
Tiffany, would you like to add anything to that question as well?
No, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And our last question for today is, what is the difference between emotional support animals and service animals, and the difference between their areas of access on campus? And Mark, if you would take that for me.
Well, I think the answer to that question depends on who you ask. There's a lot of people who think that an emotional support animal is a service animal. So an emotional support animal is an animal that provides comfort or therapeutic benefit to somebody to help them mitigate the symptoms of a disability. Generally, that would be a psychological disability, mental health. It doesn't perform a task other than calming that person down so that they can enjoy the dwelling. It's generally for residents, whether it be apartments or campus housing. That's where emotional support animals apply. They are not required to be, so what I'm looking for, they're not required to be let into campus buildings. They're just for residence halls, where a service animal is either a dog or a miniature horse that's individually trained to do work or perform tasks for a person with a disability. It's a stimulus response task. That is a service animal. A service animal could include, someone being pulled in a wheelchair by a dog. It could be a person who's being guided, who's visually impaired or blind. It could be someone who has a seizure disorder. The dog would alert them that they're about to have a seizure disorder, or diabetes, that their blood sugar is low. So it could be a wide range of tasks that animal performs, but again, it has to be a stimulus response. Just making a person feel good, this dog makes me feel good, it provides me comfort, that is not a task. That is a feeling that the dog provides. So how do you know, and how do you address it? A lot of students, and I think a lot of people in general over the course of the last 2 years have bonded a little bit more with pets, or have gotten pets than they ever have. And I think, there's a lot of social anxiety from being isolated. So a lot of people believe that they need to have their dogs with them, or animals. In ESA can be any animal for the most part. So if someone were to show up in your classroom, in your office with an animal, and they say it's a service animal, you can ask, is this, you have two inquiries, and you can ask, does this animal, and it has to be a dog if it's a service animal. If it's not a dog, then you don't have to let them in, because it is not a service animal as defined by the ADA. Does this dog provide a service? What tasks does this dog do? You can't ask about the disability. You can't ask them to verify the task of that animal. But it does have to be, like I said, a stimulus response task. So if you're unsure of that response, you should contact the appropriate department and say, hey, I'm not really sure. Can we, I want to contact the Disability Resource Office, or I want to contact HR, whoever, again, it would be the responsible office to help you decide, and maybe contact that person. The Disability Resource Office at NC State, we share that, there is no requirement for a person with a disability who travels with a service animal to contact our office before they go to class. before they go into tally or a food hall, those types of things. So it's just those two questions. If the answer is not a stimulus response, this animal makes me feel good, I get panic attacks, and the animal, I like to pet the animal, it makes me feel good. That you can say no. You can say that this animal's not able to come in. When in doubt, the animal always, whether it's a service, if it's a service animal or not, has to be under control. Under control means that it's either leashed, tethered, or if it's a task that can't be performed because of the leash, it's under vocal control, voice control of the handler. So that the animal is not laying in the middle of walkways, the animal's not barking, the animal's not disrupting whatever activities going on. They're not walking around the room, trying to get attention. A service animal is specifically trained and will sit right at the dog's or the handler's feet, and that's where they should be. If it is distracting, regardless if it's a service animal or not, you can ask it to be removed. Not the student or the person with a disability, but you can say you need to remove the animal, and you can talk about how that person might still be able to participate without the animal.
Mark, thank you. Carolyn or Tiffany, would you all like to add anything to that question? Thank you, Mark. At this time, we would like to open it up for Q&A from our attendees. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat for us. And panel, I do have one already that's already listed here for you. And it states, how do you educate faculty members so that they are aware of what they need to do to provide appropriate accommodations? Anyone from the panel is welcome to.
So does it mean in general or a particular faculty?
I'll read it one more time for you, Dr. Koning. How do you educate faculty members so that they are aware of what they need to do to provide appropriate accommodations? It just said faculty. It seems like it's just faculty in general.
So I think that it's important that that faculty invite disability services professionals into their departmental meetings, into staff trainings, and to develop those relationships so that they feel comfortable asking questions. And often we will contact a faculty member if a student is experiencing any kind of difficulty or resistance to try to support the faculty member. The thing that we try to communicate is that we are here to support you as well as the student. Because if this faculty member doesn't feel supported by disability services, then the student may not be getting what they need. So I think it may depend on the institution, but I do think it's helpful to provide regular trainings and for faculty to ask for those.
Thank you. And attendees, again, we're now open for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A for us.
I'll just tag on to what Carolyn said. At NC State, so we send an accommodation letter that lists the accommodations, and we have a web page that explains some of those accommodations that are might contain more steps than just providing the student with extended time for a test. And so we have those resources available for instructors. And then again, as Carolyn said, I mean, we really are relying on faculty or instructors to contact us when they have questions. We try to say that as frequently as possible to, if you have questions or concerns, please contact us. We do reach out to department chairs, and we do presentations when invited. We also will go and spend time in departments just doing some work there to answer any questions that might come up. That type of thing where if a faculty member doesn't want to attend a presentation. So there's a lot of ways for those instructors to get that information. But I think, again, the instructors have to be aware to ask the questions.
Panelists, thank you, Mark. Next question. Could you give some examples of common or reasonable accommodations for someone with arthritis?
I will just say that extended time on test quizzes and any assignments that require extensive writing, in addition to if the institution or department has access to a scribe or someone that could sit in and write for that particular student, I think those would be reasonable accommodations for someone that has that type of physical challenge.
Carolyn or Mark, would you all like to respond to that question as well?
I think probably the only thing, again, it's really dependent upon that person and what they're experiencing, how that arthritis, what level to what degree does it impact their ability to do activities. But possibly if they're a student, priority registration to be able to get from one, especially if NC State is such a large campus and there's a lot of opportunity to walk certain distances from one building to another, where there is no other option for transportation. It might take them longer because of the pain or the limitations and how far they can travel. So possibly priority registration. But again, it's really dependent, accommodations are dependent upon the functional limitations and how that disability limits them.
Our next question, panelists. Do youth programs on campus have to provide the same accommodations as a high school or college level?
I don't know. I don't think so. Again, it really is going to be, dependent on what the request is. I think with youth programs on campus, as long as they're not tied to high school, for example, early college, that type, or through or the high schools where students are in high school but they're taking college credit, the high school is responsible for providing accommodations beyond what can be accommodated for the college class. Now, if it's the youth program, and I see this as Joanne who's asked this question, so I know specifically what she does. So no, the answer is no to you specifically, Joanne, based on the what I know, because you are offering a program and it's not tied to their IEP.
And I just want to read the remaining of that same question. She also wanted to know, do any of you promote role models for students with disabilities to learn tips to succeed, like role models on campus?
So I'm assuming that question is like a peer mentor program. And at NC State, we do not. We have looked at that a few times, but there never seems to be the sustainability to keep it going as far as interest in providing that mentor relationship to students. And there isn't a lot of students who are asking for that. So at NC State, we do not have a program like that.
Panelists, next question. How do you address a student with a disability who emails constantly about any and everything, feel the need to respond, but emails can be at least 10 per day?
I wonder if, I don't know if that person is at Meredith or not, but yes, we have, just in a particular situation, we have, given the faculty some language to say, can we discuss this during my office hours? Can you, just because what we had was a student who peppered the faculty member with basically the equivalent of texts, but they were in, and that's just how this generation is. They don't say, dear Professor so-and-so, they don't say sincerely Carolyn, they just, what time do we have to be at class tomorrow and which assignment is due? No. And so, and then depending on in our situation, I knew the student well, so we had a number of conversations about professionalism and what's appropriate at the college level, and how can you condense all of these questions into one, and why don't we implement the 24-hour rule and wait until tomorrow to see if all of these things are still urgent. So a combination of supporting the faculty with sort of giving them permission to say it's okay if you don't answer every email. And then for us, some skill development with the student about how to interact appropriately with leadership. So I don't know. That was how we handled a particular situation, but those are hard. I don't know if others have had other recommendations.
I agree, Carolyn. I mean, that's what we do. The only thing that I would add is that, all students, regardless if they have a disability or not, are expected to meet behavior expectations. And so if there is a student who is not meeting those expectations, obviously the first line is to have a conversation with that student, and then possibly contact the disability resource office or contact student conduct to help with that, manage that situation. That being said, there might be an accommodation that the student may need to be able to meet those expectations, but they still have to meet those expectations. And so as Carolyn said, some suggestions on waiting till the end of the day to have an email or a special office hours for that student to be able to answer those questions.
Thank you, panelists, for answering that question. Our next question listed here is, have you ever had someone with allergies having a conflict with having a service animal in the same space and room?
We have. It doesn't happen frequently, but yes. It becomes a decision on what is that level of allergy. Just because you have allergies and your eyes get a little red or itchy, or you cough, you have a runny nose, that's not going to kick in to where we have to have a discussion about the disabilities. It's when there's a direct threat. So if I am in this room with a dog, my throat, I go into anaphylactic shock. I'm going to die if I'm exposed to this dog. At that time, we will have a discussion, and it sounds cold, but that really is what it would need for that student to have the discussion, whether or not we're going to remove the animal or if we're going to remove the student with the allergy. There was a case several years ago that a student had an emotional, I think it was an emotional support animal, and another student who was allergic and met those requirements, and they asked the student with the emotional support animal to leave. She sued and won because they didn't dig down far enough to say that this animal specifically would cause the anaphylactic shock. So it really gets into really a lot of details, minutia on that for that to happen. Generally, there are instructors or students who will complain because they have general allergies, but they don't have that standing they can drop the class, or they just have to sort of deal with those allergies.
Our next question, panelists, what is one thing your office would ask of your colleagues? What is one thing your offices would ask of your colleagues in all the departments to be better teammates to you and your office and support the work that you do?
Donuts and coffee on Fridays. Although Consuela wouldn't let me know that they're there, so that wouldn't be helpful to me. For me, we have a very good relationship, I think, across campus with other departments, the campus community as a whole. I think they're very supportive. They're very open to making an inclusive and welcoming environment. But I think just not being afraid, asking questions, contacting us, we're here to help. We're your partner. We're consultants. You might not like our answers all the time, but we really are trying to determine what's equal access versus success. So, we are very intentional on what we're providing as accommodations versus also saying no.
Carolyn and Tiffany, would you all like to add anything?
I just agree with everything Mark said. Don't be afraid to come talk to us. And if you say something, we will not judge you for not having 30 years experience in disabilities. Just that's why you're coming to us, because we can help process these things. We don't want to compromise essential learning objectives. We don't want to compromise the integrity of the academic programs, but we want to support faculty as you're supporting students. So yes, come to us. Just please talk to the people in your institution and collaborate.
Just to add, the ADA in Section 504, the laws, disability law in general is very hard to understand. It's not common. You can't apply common sense because a common sense doesn't work. It really is based on precedent. And if you look back, there's civil rights laws, and they are trying to allow the participation of people with disabilities into education, employment, transportation, just being active members in society. So it's really about what are we doing intentionally to make sure that we are allowing that participation. I usually will say this about the ADA or Section 504, the law. If you were driving on a road in the middle of North Carolina somewhere, and all of a sudden the speed limit sign says "Don't speed," and you drive through this area, how do you know what's speeding and what's not speeding? You might not know. It's really going to be based on what the conditions of that time. Are there a lot of people? Is there a school around? Is it raining? Is it a windy road? Is it going up and down? Is it just straight and there's no one there? You really don't know unless you know all the environmental factors. And so you really have to have that experience of here's why I shouldn't be going faster than this. There isn't a specific speed. You can check the box. All students who have a learning disability in reading get extended time, and they get this much extended time. It's really it's really individualized based on those limitations. So I think that's just something that I'll just add on in there, that is extremely difficult to understand. And I've been doing this for over 25 years, and I'm lost a lot of the time still. Don't tell my staff that, though.
I have another question for you, panelists. Have you ever thought about changing the name of people with disabilities? Some people with disabilities take offense to that term. Anyone from the panelists?
There's a whole lot of discussion about this. And some people identify as I am autistic, or I am a person who uses a wheelchair. And there's the whole debate over person first versus, identity first. And so I don't know that there's an easy answer to this. I think like so much in this field, everything is very personal. Everything is very individualized. And I think that sort of my thinking, and I don't know if you care about my thinking, but is that we need to destigmatize the word disability. It's not bad. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing, it's just different. And we associate, oh, I'm so sorry that person uses a wheelchair. Well, they're not. They're great. We just need to make the world better so they can get around better. And so we have so many negative associations that we need to change. And so you could, I mean, Mark could say something completely different, Tiffany could say something completely different, and all of my students would have 230 different things to say. So I don't know that there's a right answer to that. Yes, there are some that don't like the word disability. And I would, I don't know. Some Mark or Tiffany, please save me from here.
I agree. Nothing to save you from, Carolyn. I do think, as Carolyn said, there's a stigma there that shouldn't be there, that being disabled is not the student's fault. It is the environment for which they are interacting in that has created this inability for the student to participate. So it also is important because there's law, it's disability law. So in order to be protected, you have to have a disability. There's a lot of offices that have changed names in the last 10, 15 years, from disability to accessibility services, all kinds of different things. The problem with that is that when students are looking for our office, they may not necessarily know what accessibility, Office of Accessibility means. And that, for me, connotates a more physical relationship with accommodations than just the general. So it seems to just continue to be there. As Carolyn said, there's a lot of schools of thought on it. And we have considered it several times. We changed our name about 6-7 years ago from Disability Services to Disability Resource. But we kept the disability because of, again, it's law. We are a compliance office. When everything's all said and done, we do promote inclusion, welcoming environments, student advocacy, things like that. But we are really making sure the university is not discriminating against people with disabilities.
Thank you both. And our last question for the panelists: what are common and reasonable accommodations for students with IBS?
It depends. Again, what is the impact of the IBS on the student? Everyone's different, so it's really is going to be different. But generally, somebody with IBS would be eligible for proximity to a restroom. So they might, for housing, they might have an assignment where they're placed either close to restrooms or have a restroom within their suite. They might have on their accommodation letter ability to leave class suddenly, things like that. Again, depending upon how the IBS affects their daily living, that's where those accommodations would come into place.
Thank you, Mark. And at this time, I would like to thank our panelists for taking the time out to be on this panel with us today for disability. We really do appreciate you. And I will hand it back over to our director, Maura.
Thank you, panelists. This was fabulous. And all of the information that you provided, I think, was so helpful. Knowing that there were so many questions and engagement just shows that this is an area that we want to continue to provide professional development. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your expertise. It would not be a webinar if we did not have some technical difficulties. So Dr. Tuma had some issues with technology. So we apologize for her having to come in and out, but we appreciate her time with us too and all of her answers. I wanted to share with the attendees who are still here our upcoming events. We are planning to have one last virtual event for this semester. The session will be called Beyond Buzzwords, Strengthening Strategies in Equity and Inclusion, and it'll be hosted by Mr. Jamaica McKenzie and Mr. Gerald Cobb from NC State. So we're excited to have that on April the 28th It will be a live streamed event. They are going to be hosting something live, but we will open it up to all of our CRC members via live stream at 2 p.m. on April 28th. We'll get some information out in the next few weeks for you to register for that. Our summer workshops, our committees are very much underway planning these events. And so we are excited that right now, if we knock on wood and fingers crossed, we will be in person this summer. Our library workshop that happens each summer will be hosted at NC State. And we are looking at some dates in June for that event. And then our staff professional development all-day conference will be at Wake Tech's Southern Wake campus, their largest campus. And that will be on July the 20th. And it will be in person with sessions. So we're very excited to bring that back this summer. Thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you again in April. And thank you again, panelists. And thank you, Consuela, for moderating. You did a fabulous job.
Thanks for everyone who came and spent time with us.